part 5 of the lecture series on World War I, wrapping up chapter 19, the major concepts. So, as you can see, the title of this one is Peace, and it's a question. Did we have peace? Absolutely not. Could we have had long-lasting peace? We never will know because it's not the way it shook out. But just know this, World War I's peace treaty actually leads to a second, much more severe and widespread conflict in the 1940s. Also leads to widespread problems for Germany. Lots of stuff that leads to the rise of Hitler. So we'll go through a few of those concepts here in just a second. But mentioned last time, the United States gets into the war very end of it. Okay, we declare war in 1917. We actually commit troops to this, even though there were a few Americans that went over and fought as volunteers for various things. There were a few American pilots that joined the Lafayette Escadrille and flew air combat missions over there. But again, no official U.S. military personnel actually entered into combat missions until May of 1918. When the Americans got out onto the battlefield, many people are just in shock of how eager the Americans are to fight. After all, the Europeans have been in this long drawn-out conflict since 1914 and been in it essentially for at this point in time almost 4 years. 3 years, 9-10 months at that point in time, and they're ready to go home. The Americans get there and they just overwhelm the enemy with the number of or the sheer number of people that are there, the fresh troops, with their leadership and bravery. So anyway, these people are eager to fight, and they're eager to fight under a guy named John J. Pershing, who is from Laclede, Missouri, which is in north central Missouri. John J. Pershing is our top general. Actually winds up resigning his commission towards the end of the war due to various stresses. Actually lost his family, his wife and daughter, and maybe a couple of daughters in a house fire prior to World War I. But this weighs heavily on him, and seeing the amount of things that he did out on the front lines really just gets to him, and he winds up stepping down towards the end. But at the beginning of the war, for the Americans, he is the top leader, which they call the American Expeditionary Forces. This, of course, became the leadership of the war, much like we did in World War II, where the Americans come in and wind up basically forming field operations that led to British and French cooperating with us, so on and so forth. His nickname is Blackjack. That had to do with his time at West Point, in which there was something having to do with African Americans at West Point. It had nothing to do with him being a gambler, but anyway, the origins of that nickname come from his days at West Point, and it had nothing to do with taking risk, which a lot of people thought he took a lot of risk in the battlefield in World War I, but nothing really relevant to the point here. There were some people that were told, once you go over the top of the trenches, even if you don't have a rifle, just pick up the first one you see on the ground. Okay, so that's the type of thing the Americans were facing down and type of gambles that we took. But anyway, new weapons also helped the Americans turn the tide. The airplane, in particular, the Americans get over there and they have a fresh supply of airplanes with them. Our top flying ace, the Germans had Manfred von Richthofen, but our top flying ace was a guy named Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was actually the son of German immigrants. He had a very thick German accent. He was, by profession, a race car driver, raced in the first Indianapolis 500. Originally, he wanted to make all American race car drivers pilots in the war, and he was basically laughed out of the military offices whenever he proposed this, because he did it with, like I said, a very thick German accent. But he volunteered to become a pilot and wound up within the span of May to November of 1918, had 34 battles, shot down 26 planes in those 34 battles. Now, Eddie Rickenbacker is actually flying over the front lines whenever World War I ends, and there's actually a few accounts of that, and I may post his account of what that looked like here in just a bit. So Eddie Rickenbacker, I actually have this photo up in my classroom at Carl Junction, but Eddie Rickenbacker is depicted here, sitting in his plane out on the battlefield, or behind the front lines. A couple other Americans that I'm going to talk about really quick, one of which is in your notes, the other one is not. Mentioned the heavy influence that Missouri has upon World War I. This actually continues with this guy right here. And this guy is our last World War I veteran that died, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. I believe he was 109 years old. But this is Frank Buckles. Okay, and Frank Buckles, like I said, he is the last American veteran of World War I. He was 16 years old whenever he joined the war in 1918. He wound up driving an ambulance at the age of 16. Okay, he was not drafted. He was over there as a volunteer. But Frank Buckles is actually from northwest Missouri in a little town called Bethany, and that's where my dad's family is from. Okay, but anyway, kind of their little claim to fame there. John J. Pershing's from about a half hour east of there in northern Missouri. But this other guy right here is one that history has largely forgotten, and so I do try to bring awareness to him for my students at least. The ultimate American hero of the war is this guy named Alvin York. Okay, Alvin York actually started off as a conscientious objector because he was a Quaker who believed in pacifism and did not want to see combat or take somebody's life in war. Well, the deal with Alvin York was eventually he sat down with a spiritual leader and they said, you know, you can go and do this in the name of God, and you don't necessarily have to be a combatant. He joined the war. Well, he became a war hero and went into American legend. As you can see here, after he led 7 Americans to kill or wound 20 Germans and take 132 prisoners during a battle. He is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his leadership. He actually has a movie depicting his life made in the 1930s or 1940s called Sergeant York, in which Gary Cooper, a very famous actor at the time, portrayed him. But anyway, he was a very skilled shot with his rifle, come to find out, and was able to just repeatedly bombard this German detachment. And eventually, like I said, there were 7 Americans that they wound up killing 20 people and take 132 prisoners. They thought there were hundreds of men after them instead of just these 7, okay, whenever they surrendered. But anyway, Americans get over to they get over to Europe, and the first thing they have to do is they have to stop a German advance on Paris in 1918. As they stop this German advance and start pushing the Germans back, the goal is to push them eventually out of France and then back into Germany. Okay, so this is going to take place much over the course of where the war had taken place over the previous 4 years, but the Americans ride in and quickly turn the tide of the battle because of people like Alvin York. Okay, but this did, with this advancement, and with people like Alvin York, it signified the capabilities of fresh American soldiers. It made Germans question their motives. Why are we doing this? Should we continue doing this? The Germans are regularly running out people between the ages of 14 to 16 years old to fight this war. They have lost almost an entire generation of men as a result of this war. Okay, now towards the end of this war, or towards the end of the war, as I said before, they get over there in early 1918. By November, okay, late October, early November, the Germans know that their war effort is lost, and they begin to seek a negotiation of peace. Okay, they know that this peace is going to come at a cost for them. They did not know how much, and actually, this is not the goal of the Americans to punish the Germans, but nevertheless, Germany is going to negotiate an armistice or a ceasefire that takes effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So that is November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. Paris time. Whenever the treaty is, or sorry, not the treaty, whenever the armistice goes into effect, church bells ring across Europe, across the United States, signifying that the war is over and that people are, the combat missions are able to stop. This is the first time where you see whenever the ceasefire is issued, you see people literally fight up until the second that the ceasefire takes place. They drop their weapons, they get out of the trenches, and they go across the battlefield, shake hands, and hug. Okay, you also do not have battles taking place months upon months after this ends, like you did the Civil War. Okay, so in the aftermath of the war, the ceasefire takes effect. It is not a peace treaty, though. Okay, it just means they are not going to keep fighting on the battlefield. They then decide that they need to have a sit down and hammer out a peace treaty, decide, what punishments are going to be doled out, what agreements are going to be doled out as a result of this, and what all is going to happen with the world, because they knew there needed to be changes to prevent this from happening again. They implement some of those changes, they didn't get them right, and it does happen again, and it's much, much worse the second time it happens. But anyway, in the aftermath of the war, The biggest hangup that people are going to have is this issue with the League of Nations, and you'll read a little bit about this week. Okay, now the League of Nations, first and foremost, this is basically supposed to be a place where every country can send a representative, and they go and sit down and talk out their differences, so that way they cannot go to war, or they prevent going to war. They also can bring charges against other nations there, say that they are rebuilding their militaries too quickly, so on and so forth. And the League of Nations was supposed to be just a peacemaking thing. It was not supposed to be any sort of alliance or military or anything like that. But here in the United States, President Wilson's actually the one that comes up with the idea of the League of Nations. His idea included the Americans being in this. Well, many Americans want to go back to being isolated and not intervening in world affairs. They knew that if we ever got into this, we would be quote-unquote the world's police, and we'd have to go solve multiple conflicts, and they did not want to have this role. Well, spoiler alert, whenever this ends, whenever the League of Nations ends during World War II and reforms as the United Nations, and the Americans join, the very first things that happen, or many people's fears, is the Americans have to commit troops to prevent conflicts and actually wind up getting into a couple of conflicts as a result of their membership in it. But League of Nations, we decided not to join, thanks to the efforts of a guy named Henry Cabot Lodge, who I'll talk about here in a second. The other thing that happens during this, Woodrow Wilson actually showed up with 14 points for peace, which you will take a look at this week as well. And his 14 points basically were efforts to prevent the war, or prevent another war, and have long-lasting peace throughout Europe. Now, as a result of this, the Allies, particularly the British and the French, start looking at the peace agreements and they say, absolutely not, we need to have some punishments in here as well. We've been fighting this war longer than you all. You all don't have the final say on this peace treaty. We want to punish those who we feel are responsible. Which, if you remember back, it was Austria-Hungary and the sorry, just slipped my train of thought just slipped. It was Serbia and Austria-Hungary that actually start the war. Germany, because they're the ones that fueled the fire of the war, they're the ones to get the ire of both Britain and France. And in the peace agreement, in the Treaty of Versailles, there's actually going to be multiple provisions of that treaty that take a look at Germany and tell the Germans, here's what you can't do, here's what you must be able to do, here's the punishments you're going to have, so on and so forth. Okay, among those punishments and among those things Germany had to do, they had to admit their war guilt, they had to pay reparations. They actually don't get the war reparations paid off until 2010 or 2011. And war reparations basically means they paid back Britain and France for the amount of damages that they caused in this war. And then they also had to pay back, I believe, some of the war costs for those nations, okay, with interest. And in the 1920s, we do some pretty stupid stuff so that Germany can actually pay this back because Germany can't actually afford to do this. But I'll talk more about that whenever we get to the Warren Harding administration in a couple of weeks. But anyway, Germany could not afford to pay back these war reparations. The value of their money, the Reichsmark, is actually going to be taken down to about zero, to the point where, as you'll see here in just a minute, the joke was that some people had to take an entire wheelbarrow full of Reichsmarks to the store so they could buy a loaf of bread. Other people were pasting them on the walls of their homes and using the Reichsmark as wallpaper. This is, of course, their paper money. Just because it took so much to buy so little. And anyway, I've got a couple other stories about that here in just a second. But anyway, Wilson's 14 points for peace, like I said, as you'll read here in just a second, they are decimated by the Allies. They want to punish Germany. They don't want to have all this stuff about, democracy and we're going to promote peace for years to come. They want to have vengeance for this, and they want the Germans to pay. And the Germans did pay, but because of these punishments, the German people cannot take them. Whenever a guy promises relief to these people and actually brings back prosperity to Germany and restarts the military, he becomes very popular, and that guy's name is Hitler. And you'll read about, right before World War II, whenever we talk about appeasement, why Hitler was so opposed to the Treaty of Versailles. So anyway, that League of Nations, as I said before, the United States is not going to join. as a result of the efforts of Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a senator who hopes the United States could go back to being a neutral nation. And then also it's or the League of Nations itself does not see Germany join, okay, because they are not allowed to join. That was one of their punishments. They could not sit at the League of Nations, which if you're trying to promote peace and you're trying to have an international organization to promote peace, you probably need to have the people that you're blaming for this war in there. So that was major, major mess up on the part of the people that formed the League of Nations. Okay, the other thing, like I said, the United States refused to join because they took out, the Senate, of course, has to sign off on all treaties. The Senate refused to ratify the part of the treaty that called for the U.S. to join the League of Nations. Okay, and I already mentioned why that is. Wilson keeps demanding the treaty be ratified with the League of Nations membership within it, and it keeps getting voted down. Wilson's actually going to go out, and I'll talk about this here in a second, but Wilson's actually going to go out for months at a time speaking to the people themselves, not just congressmen, but actually to American voters, saying you need to contact your congressman and you need to say we need to be a part of this, otherwise we're going to wind up with another conflict at some point in time, and the United States needs to be a leader in this, not a bystander. Well, Wilson actually, as he's giving speeches, works himself into very poor health and actually suffers a stroke in mid-speech at one of these stops in Colorado. Okay, this actually left him paralyzed on half of his body and his speech slurred to the point where he was kept at the White House under basically secret conditions by his wife Edith, who you can see here. But President Wilson basically was, we now believe, unfit to run the nation according to his health. But anyway, Edith Wilson, his wife, actually winds up running the nation as president in his absence. She actually ran cabinet meetings, had him sign things, but as you can see here, he is being directed on what to do by Edith Wilson here. Just a second. President Wilson never did recover from this, actually died a couple years after leaving office. But anyway, nowadays we would not have this situation where a first lady actually runs the United States. The cabinet would actually be able to vote out the president under the 25th Amendment. Okay, and sorry, that's what I was looking up. I wanted to make sure my amendment was right. I almost said 26, but it was 25th Amendment. Allows the cabinet, if they feel the president is unfit to serve, to vote him out. And that, of course, is because Wilson suffered this stroke and was unfit to lead the nation due to health reasons. Okay, so anyway, of course, the Treaty of Versailles eventually is signed, and the treaty is ratified by the United States without the provision of us joining the League of Nations. But anyway, we also signed a separate treaty with Germany in 1921, basically to guarantee certain things with Germany, help them financially in some aspects. Again, this is not being neutral. This is still world affairs. We're just not committing troops to these things. Okay, so anyway, of the harsh punishments the Germans had to face as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, with the hyperinflation, things of that sort, and the various punishments, tearing down their military, not being able to have this military. The harsh punishments actually wind up having many politicians in Germany calling for retaliation. Okay, most famous of these people that rose to power, of course, is Hitler, or most infamous, as I should say, because he hoped to place Germany on the right track by building up the military. And then he began inflicting his very flawed views on race and racial superiority. And whenever that happened, that's whenever the various tragedies of the Holocaust happened. And again, we'll go more into detail on this when we get to World War II. But the Americans, Woodrow Wilson remains president until 1920. Okay, at the end of 1920, of course, he is not going to run again. He's unable to run again, not because of term limits, just because of health and ability to lead. But anyway, Republicans are actually going to come in and promise a return to normalcy. And this is kind of where you see conservatism start to rise in the United States a little bit. But conservatism, as we know it now, of course, did not come in until the late 1960s. But anyway, many conservative Americans wanted the Americans to quit or quit stepping on foreign influence or quit trying to apply foreign influence, and we decided we were going to remain neutral until we were forced into World War II. Okay, so the question I had overall with this was, did it bring peace? Not really, but here you can see these are stacks of German, essentially dollar bills or Reichmarks, where you have a guy here uh, trying to this looks like a life savings of somebody here that they're trying to pull around. You have children here playing and building towers out of this right here. There was a joke in Germany that somebody actually went and held up a bank, and as they were running out of the bank, they turned with this bag of cash that they had, dumped out the Reichmarks because it was useless, and then took off the bag that they had taken instead. Okay, so various things happened as a result of this. But anyway, World War One, did it accomplish anything? Well, yes, we learned quite a few things that help us win future wars. We also established the fact that women are capable in the workplace and women are able to vote as a result. And then also we get a few things out of there where if you have presidents unfit to serve because of health, you can now remove them. But anyway, World War One, while it has some major influences to this day, in terms of the war to end all wars, absolutely not. Okay, various issues with that. So that is going to actually conclude Chapter 19. That is going to conclude Unit 1. And I will be going over in just a bit some details on how to review for your first exam and what that first exam is going to look like. So have a good rest of your week, and we will see you in a bit.